Okay. I'd like to thank Michael Comfort, Lee Martin, and the Grand Lodge, Pennsylvania for the honor of being able to speak to you from the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, or as I'd like to call it, my basement, because I'm not actually there. My name is Christopher Yoder, and I am the library director, the librarian, curator, archivist, and other important sounding words that I looked up in the thesaurus to make my sound important. But I am from the Trexler Masonic Library. Give you a little bit about my background. I am a member of Greenleaf Lodge number 561, Catasauqua Royal Arch Chapter number 278, Allen Council number 23, Royal and Select Masters, Lux Ex Tenebris number 176, Allied Masonic degrees, and I currently have almost my second degree. Finished my second year at the Academy of Masonic Knowledge in Pennsylvania. Also, I am, hang on. There we go. I'm also a certified EMT in the state of Pennsylvania. I currently run 911 calls for a living, which means I take your 3-day-old knee pain to the hospital. And I am also have a BA in theater and an MFA in acting, which means that I'm fully qualified to wait tables. So in thinking about how do you talk about a library, I couldn't think of anything more boring to talk about. So I went online and talked to the ChatGPT AI, and I asked it to come up with some interesting taglines for the library, if it could do that. So it came up with unleash the power of knowledge and brotherhood at the Trexler Masonic Library. How about discover the secrets of the craft at the Trexler Masonic Library, where knowledge meets fraternity? Or enlighten your mind, strengthen your bond, the Harry C. Trexler Masonic Library, your gateway to Freemasonry. And then I started having a little fun with it, and I thought, well, what if, say, other authors wrote the tagline for this? So I said, what if, say, Shakespeare wrote it? To read or not to read? That is the question. The Trexler Masonic Library, the answer to your heart's suggestion. Or, say, Tolkien, one library to rule them all, one library to find them, one library to bring them all, and in Masonic knowledge, bind them at the Trexler Masonic Library. And then finally, books and knowledge, what a treat. The Trexler Library can't be beat. Anyway, the library is located at the Allentown Masonic Temple, which is 1524 West Linden Street in Allentown. It's on the 5th floor. And actually, the Masonic Temple is celebrating its 100th anniversary of the cornerstone laying this year. To give you a little background as far as the history goes, in the minutes of the Trexler Masonic Library Board in 1960, there was a brief history of the library that, as it was related by Daniel W. Ham, who was then the librarian. He said that sometime in 1927, 1928, there was a George Roberts of Sharon Hill, Pennsylvania, that had approximately 2,500 volumes of Masonic books that he wanted to dispose of. And so he contacted a Mr. Rice in Bethlehem, who owned a secondhand bookstore. Now, Mr. Rice didn't purchase it because he felt that it was a little bit too big of a proposition for him to handle. So Dr. Reverend John Bear Stout, who we know in the Lehigh Valley here was a famous and popular Reformed pastor. He was the associate president of Cedar Crest College. He was on the committee of the Pennsylvania German Society, as well as other historical societies in the Lehigh Valley. And he was a member of New Temple Lodge number 720, which incidentally is also celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. Anyway, he frequents Dr. or Mr. Rice's place of business. So Mr. Rice, the book dealer, contacted Dr. Stout about the library, and in turn, Dr. Stout took up the matter with his fellow librarian or his fellow Mason, who is Harry C. Trexler, Barger Lodge, number 333. Now, in the Lehigh Valley here, we all know who Harry Trexler was. Harry Trexler is a businessman, philanthropist, conservationist. He took over the Trexler Lumber Company from his father. He was the first CEO of Portland Cement Company. He was one of the founders of PP&L. He started the Allentown Park System. The Trexler Trust, which bears his name, has donated millions of dollars and supported many organizations in the Lehigh Valley. So he asked 3 of his fellow Masons to examine the library and report to him as to condition of the books, whether they were worth the price that was asked for. They did so. They came back with a favorable report. So in 1928, he presents the collection of books to the Masonic Temple Association. He pays for library shelving. In 1929, he underwrites the hiring of a librarian, who happened to be Dr. Stout, to catalog the books, and then he formally presents the library to the Allentown Masonic Temple and the Lehigh Valley in April of 1930. And now Trexler passed away in November of 1933, and in his will, via the Trexler Trust, he provides very generously for the maintenance and expansion of the library in perpetuity. So now, the Harry C. Trexler Masonic Library is a 501c3 charitable organization. It has approximately 8,000 titles of Masonic and related subjects, which include anti-Masonic books and pamphlets, some of which collected by Trexler himself, and many rare books and documents. So, the purpose of the library. Why do we exist? Well, Trexler formally presented it as for use of the Masons of the entire Lehigh Valley and their Masonic guests. Now, the bylaws state that the purpose of the library, it's twofold. It's to provide a collection of Masonic and Masonic-related general subject works, including rare books, manuscripts, audio, videotapes, published works, documents, records, arts, artifacts, etc., to promote the scholarship and increase knowledge among Masons of the Lehigh Valley, their guests, and the general public. Yes, we are a public library, albeit in some ways that we're limited. And also that we are to preserve the historic aspects of Masonry and Masons in the Lehigh Valley. Now, Carl H. Cloudy, who was the executive secretary of the Masonic Service Association for many, many years, wrote a book called The Old Past Master, where he talks about things in Freemasonry. He says that the main purpose of a rightly conducted Masonic library is to convey knowledge to its owners and users. However, the Masonic library is poorly conceived and illy furnished, which contains only books upon Masonry. A doctor's library, which had books only on office practice and business systems, would be of little help to the physician. So a Masonic library should be a knowledge of all of all knowledge, including a great deal of Masonry, but as much on philosophy, science, religion, art, history, that its users have the opportunity to learn. So, what do we have? Well, we got some really cool stuff. We got books, we got coats, we got hats, we got goats, we got platters, we got ewers, we've got medals, and we've got skewers. We've got posters, we got spankers, we got knockers, and we even have nutcrackers. Now, okay, that's fine. You say everybody's got those. What do we have that you ain't got? Well, we have almost an entire collection of the Ars Quater Coronatorum, which is the proceedings from the premier Masonic research lodge in the world in London. Those go back to 1886. as long as we have some other Masonic Research Lodges collections, Texas, Iowa, North Carolina, Missouri. We have most of the proceedings of the major Masonic bodies in Pennsylvania and the national bodies on both the York and the Scottish Rite sides. We have all the facsimiles of the Masonic Book Club. We have a rather extensive George Washington collection with histories, writings, letters, journals, and the like. If you like esoteric stuff, we have a large collection of Reuben Swinburne Clymer, who was the Grand Master of the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross, the Rosicrucians, which are located just south of us here in Quakertown. Also, Mark Stavish at the Institute for the Hermetic Studies in Wilkes-Barre donated his entire catalog of publications to us. Not impressed. Okay. Well, what if you wanted to, say, learn about the Civil War from an eyewitness to it? This is the Civil War in America, Lossing from 1886, and then follow along with actual military maps of the battles. You could do that. Or if you wanted to learn about hieroglyphics and symbolism in Egyptian art, and then check out a facsimile of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, complete with pull-out pages of the scroll. That's pretty cool. Or you could look at Manly P. Hall's Symbolic Philosophy book, which all of its many colored prints. We have facsimiles of the Astronomicon Caesarium, which helps calculate the altitude of the stars and the planetary positions using an astrolabe. And it's got really working practical pieces in the book. However, you just need to be able to read Latin. And speaking of not being able to read it, we also have a facsimile of the Voynich manuscript, which is this mysterious document from the 1400s that has never been deciphered. But we have a lot of books on that as well now. I'm sorry, what's your question? No. Okay. How about, did you know that Thomas Jefferson created his own Bible? Believe it or not, yes. He took a razor blade and some glue, and he cut up the Bible and pieced the Gospels together in chronological order, not to mention that he cut out the bits that he didn't like. We have two facsimiles of those. So back to Cloudy here. Cloudy says that something has to be said about including books in lighter veins in Masonic libraries. He says, I think they should be included. One gives candy to a child to make the taking of medicine easy, so why not the inclusion of books of purely entertainment character to make the use of the library easy to those who know little of libraries? As one who once came to scoff remained to pray, so it is that the case that the man who starts to browse in a library after light fiction remains to examine and be interested by works of real information. So, whereas we have quite a lot of books on Ben Franklin, we also have Fart Proudly. And while we have the first edition of the Harvard Classic books, all the great books of the Western world, we also have Dan Brown. And while we have a lot of scholarly books on the Knights Templar, we also have a book on Oak Island. Not to mention Barry and Corey and Christopher and Kurtz. So what about all these curiosities, wonders, and rarities of which I spoke? Well, here we go. Curious item and some tidbits here. We have a Maryland Hyman Risen from 1797. Inside, it's got an inscription. The inscription says, Simon Forrester, PM, presents his compliments to Charles White, G. and R.L.B., Secretary, Merrimack Lodge, something, something, the Hyman Reason Grand Key of Freemasonry, something, something, Salem, January, and then a date. It's kind of hard to make out some of the inscriptions in some of these books. Well, I was able to discover that Captain Simon Forrester was born in 1784 in Ireland. Now, he arrived in Salem, Massachusetts in 1767, the age of 19. He was a member of the crew of the schooner Salisbury. Now, the captain of the Salisbury, I believe the captain was Daniel Hawthorne, who was the grandfather of author Nathaniel Hawthorne, invited Forrester to stay in Salem in his home on Union Street. Now, Simon Forrester married Hawthorne's daughter. He became the pioneers of the Salem Merchant Shipping Company and one of Salem's leading merchants and philanthropists. Now, he was a member of the Salem Marine Society and served on a committee which arranged for the lighthouse to be built on Baker's Island. And his house, his house is located on 188 Derby Street in Salem. And he acquired this in 1791. He died in 1817, and he's buried in Charter Street Burying Point. Now, he is also mentioned in Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. And his claim to fame is that he also wrote a letter to James Madison as his president. And it is actually in James Madison's stuff. You can find that online. Now, the Charles White that he wrote this book to was the first candidate to the newly established Merrimack Lodge in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and was its worshipful master in 1815. Now, the book also contains a signature of a Charles White of 1807 and a Charles W. Bartleman, Haverhill, 1854. I haven't been able to figure out who those people are, and I have no idea how in the world that we got this book. Anyway, another interesting book that we have a copy, a leather-bound red copy of Masonic Celebrities, Albert Pike, by R.F. Gould. That's Robert F. Gould. I'll talk about him later. But in case you want to notice here, this has Lillian Pike's name embossed in the front of it. Now, Lillian Pike was, of course, the daughter of Albert Pike. She was a native of Arkansas. Now, she comes to Washington with her father. Now, Albert Pike is very big in the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. He was the supreme commander of the Scottish Rite, southern jurisdiction. He was also a Confederate officer. She was one of the original organizers of the Confederate Monument Association, the Southern Relief Society, and the National Historical Association. And she also organized the Martha Washington chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution and continued in charge of that longer than any other member. Now, inside of that is a nice letter to Lillian Pike from George W. or G.W. Spieth, who was one of the founding members of that Cutter Coronati Lodge, the research lodge in London that I mentioned earlier. And he was its secretary for 14 years. It says, to Lillian Pike, in token of brotherly sympathy, with her loss and in loving admiration of her noble father, G.W. Spieth, Secretary Margate Kent. Here's another cool book. I mentioned a facsimile of the Book of the Dead earlier, in Egypt earlier. One of the non-facsimile curious books that we have is an original book by Giovanni Battista Belzoni. Now, Belzoni, was known as the Great Belzoni. Now, he was an Italian explorer. He was a circus strongman, and he was an Egyptian archaeologist who's credited with some discoveries and firsts in Egyptology, such as being the first in modern times to penetrate the second pyramid at Giza. That's the pyramid at Khafre. Now, he published a book of his exploits entitled The Narrative, the Operations, and Recent Discoveries Within the Pyramids, Temples, Tombs, Excavations in Egypt and Nubia in 1820 in Brussels. Now, later in 1835, his wife Sarah republishes this book, and she includes a number of handwritten sheets. Now, this book has become known as the Belzoni Masonic manuscript. And in this book, she describes, or Belzoni describes, Masonic initiation, which he claimed he found evidence of in Egyptian hieroglyphics, which proves that Freemason originated in Egypt or earlier. And this is dedicated to the Masonic Brethren universally. And all of this is signed by Sarah Belzoni herself. Yeah, I don't know how we got that one either. Here's another cool one. It's a 4-volume set bound in leather. It's in French, but it's a history of the Knights Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem by the Abbé Vertot. Approximately 1726 it was published. Inside of it, the cover of volume 1 is a book plate from Edward, the Duke of Norfolk, Earl Marshal of England, which means that he had this book in his library at some time. Now, this was most likely Edward Howard, the 9th Duke of Norfolk. That's no relation to Moshe Curly. He held the title from 1732 to 1777. Now, the Duke of Norfolk, Earl Marshal of England, is the highest rank of peerage in England. That's one short of the Duke of Cornwall, which is reserved for the Prince of Wales, which is the son of the reigning monarch. Now, that is currently Prince William now with King Charles. Now, the Duke of Norfolk is a hereditary title, and that's passed down from Edward I, who was also known as Edward Longshanks, or the Hammer of the Scots, for those of you that are familiar with Braveheart. He was the baddie in Braveheart. And yes, I'm all about outdated movie references. In our more bizarro section of the library, we have this book, The Account of the Reception of the Heart of Our Martyred Brother, Ex-Governor Ignacio Herrera Cairo, at the hands of our sister, Senora Rosalia de County, yada, 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 by the Rosecroix chapter in Oakland, California. Key words here are the account of the reception of his heart. Now, Ignacio Herrera Cairo was governor of Jalisco, Mexico, where the capital is Guadalajara. And he happened to be the Grand Master of the Masonic Veterans Association of the Pacific Coast. Now, the story goes that he was the arch enemy of the Catholic Church because while he was governor, he imprisoned a group of Carmelite friars who he said was plotting against the government. Now, it says that the Catholic Church never forgave him, and Herrera feared for his life from that day on. So now, in 1858, a group of men show up at his ranch to kill the guy. In anticipation of his eventual death, he asks his fellow Masonic brothers that if he was ever murdered, they need to preserve his heart to show that he had the heart of a man who died for his devotion to Masonic principles. Now, it should be noted that he had frequent problems with military commanders under his control. He resigned because of that. Some of the corrupt commanders spread rumors that he had guns stashed at his ranch, and so why the military showed up and killed him. These commanders were then tried and hanged for it, so the Catholics really didn't have anything to do with it. However, they preserved his heart, and 35 years later, his heart is sent from Mexico to Oakland, California by his sister, and it's kept at the Masonic temple there. And when his heart's ready for burial, thousands of Masons show up at the gates of the Mount View Cemetery, along with 4 Knights of the Rose Croix that escort his little tiny copper casket, which is draped in a Mexican flag, to his final resting place. The casket has his heart in it, and it's placed beneath a granite monument where Rosalinda assured that all his final wishes were properly honored as a martyr to the cause of Freemasonry. Now, his heart, or the monument rather, can actually still be seen at Mount View Cemetery in Oakland. And there's a couple other dead famous people there, like Domingo Giardelli, the Chocolate King, as well as James Folger, the Coffee King, is also buried there. And you might say he was a few miles short of leaving his heart in San Francisco. But I'll be here all week. Try the veal. Okay, here's my weirdest, even more bizarro section of the library. Copy of The Human Vivisection of Sir Washington Irving Bishop, the first and world eminent mind reader. This book is subtitled A Mother's Life Dedicated and an Appeal for Justice to All Brother Masons and the Generous Public, a synopsis of the butchery of the late Sir Washington Irving Bishop, a most worthy Mason of the 32nd degree, mind reader, and philanthropist. Okay. Washington Irving Bishop was a stage magician. And like most of the magician type folks of the late 1800s, he started off with spiritualist act and then started exposing these spiritualist acts like seances and spirit knocking, that kind of thing. He moves into the realm of mentalism and mind reading, and he became quite popular. Now, he never claimed that he had any supernatural natural abilities, because he called it muscle reading, which was being able to pick up on involuntary muscle responses and body language. On May 12th, 1889, Bishop's asked to perform at the prestigious Lamb's Club in New York City. During his performance, he collapses and he falls into a coma. He's taken upstairs and pronounced dead by 2 doctors that were on scene. The doctors then proceed to do an autopsy for him, and they saw open his skull and they take his brain out to examine it. There's only one problem with that. Apparently, Bishop suffered from cataleptic fits. Now, cataleptic fits were when people would fall into these states of unconsciousness. Sometimes their bodies would go very rigid, and they would be that way for hours at a time. And it was rumored that he even carried a letter along with him stating as such, saying, I have these cataleptic fits, I'm not actually dead. However, there was no card on him at the time of his autopsy, so they very well may have pulled out his brain while he was still alive. That was quite a surprise to him. So there was a trial, but the doctors were cleared because obviously there's no proof that they could prove that he wasn't dead already. However, his poor mother writes this book and publishes this book as a heartfelt appeal to the public. Now, it is heavy on pathos, apparently. You see here, there's a picture of her draped in almost nun-like apparel, gazing longingly at her, or gazing lovingly at her son. And you see that he's got a scar along his head here, across his forehead. She sent this book and she sent letters to pretty much practically everyone and anyone that would read it. She, of course, didn't have any income, and so she was seeking retribution and compensation for her loss. So inside this book, we have a handwritten note. In the back of it says, Mr. and Mrs. A.M. Palmer, with compliments of the author, the sad and lonely mother of their beloved and devoted friend, the martyr, whose noble heart and something purses maybe were ever open to administer to the unfortunate and the needy. Aims of fickle fortune, May 7th, 1891, New York. Read something on the last pages. And on the last page is an address where they can send money. Again, how we got this in our book, I don't know. Okay, well, what about the really rare stuff you asked me? Well, I'll tell you. In 1923, Lionel Vibbert, who was master of the aforementioned Cutter Coronati Research Lodge in London, he sets out to make a catalog of all the scarce Masonic books that were known. Now, I don't mean your church's recipe book that might have been printed, but nobody cares about. We're talking about really rare stuff here. Like, for example, Aristotle supposedly wrote a second book of Poetics, which he references he was either going to write or never did write, or it was destroyed in time somewhere. There's actually a lot of books like that that we have lost to antiquity. Other authors have talked about them, but they have nowhere to be seen. Anyway, of the 91 or so books that are mentioned in Vibbert's book, we have 18 of them. Some of them we have more than one copy. Now, there are some that we have different editions of, but those aren't necessarily the rarest copies. However, such as this. Number 21 on page 40. We have the Masonic medals of the medals of the Masonic fraternity, described and illustrated by William T. Marvin of Boston, 1880. There's apparently only 160 copies of those were issued. Fortunately, we have two of them. Now, although only 160 copies were printed of this book, I got this offline. It said copies rarely appear on the market because mostly seem to have been distributed through Masonic channels. Now, Lyman Lowe, who lived at the turn of the century, he was a coin dealership in New York. He was a librarian of the American Numismatic Society. That's coins and medals. He claimed that 20 copies of this book perished in a fire. And there's a postcard in the library of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts that confirms that many copies were indeed destroyed by a fire in Marvin's office. This book has never been reprinted. Now, Marvin also published a supplement to this book, which is also very rare. And nearly every copy of this Masonic medals book that ever comes up on auction is incomplete. It does not have the supplement in it. The book ends halfway through to this description of medal number 1277. The book just ends. Fortunately, we have the supplement as well. Here's one, number 30, page 30, number 5, under historical, is the Freemasons Monitor, or the Illustrations of Freemasonry, by Thomas Smith Webb. Now, Thomas Smith Webb was the father of the York Rite in America. Says this book is yada, yada, yada. It's in 2 parts. Many editions, later ones, additional matter was included. The original edition is of exceptional rarity, and a reprint was issued in 1899. We have both copies of those. We have the original 1797 version, as well as the 1889 version, as well as we have 3 facsimiles of this book. Here's another cool one. The Oration of Frederick Dalcho. Now, Dalcho was a British-born American clergyman, had a major effect on Freemasonry in South Carolina. In 1801, he became a 33rd degree Mason, helped form the Supreme Council Southern Jurisdiction at Charleston in South Carolina. He served as the first Lieutenant Grand Commander of the Supreme Council. Of extreme rarity, it says, 1 copy in the Library of Lodge Cutter Coronati, the other at Worcester, and another in the Trexler Masonic Library at Allentown. Not only do we have this copy was Robert Freak Gould's personal copy. Now, I talked about Gould earlier. Now, Gould was an eminent Masonic historian. His History of Freemasonry, it's a 7-volume History of Freemasonry. It's one of the standards of Freemasonry. Inside it, we have a book. Says, I'm sending you this book by post, Dalcho's Orations, and should be glad if you'll kindly acknowledge the same. It may be interested to you that this book was presented to me several years ago by the late brother S.B. Oldman, Deputy Grand Secretary of something, Grand Lodge, something, R.F. Gould, Kingsfield, Woking, England. February 11th, 1893. Now, I'm not sure who the card is, who's it addressed to. Actually, I did pull it out, but I can't remember who it's addressed to. But it is Gould's own copy. Now, how in the world do we get Gould's personal copy in the library? I have no idea. Now, there are many, 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 many more interesting and unique items in our library, but I'm going to end with these 2. Page 16 and 17 under Constitutions. 1856, A Hyman Reason, first edition. 1878, third editions by Lawrence Dermott. We have both the first and the third edition copies of Dermott's A Hyman Reason. This is a picture of his first edition, but sadly it's in really, really bad condition. One of the biggest challenges to a library is the environment. Now, ideally, it needs to be between 30 and 50% humidity and really no more than 70 degrees. And if any of you have ever been on the 5th floor of the Masonic Temple in July and August, know that it's rather unbearable up there. Now, we've tried to circumvent this. We purchased a very nice air conditioner and dehumidifier, but even that sometimes can barely keep up with the humidity in there. I mean, even with the air conditioner, sometimes I didn't even want to be in there. Anyway, here's the last choice piece. Anderson's Constitutions, 300 years old as of this year, published 1723. Says here, perfect copies with the half title. It's got a half title Constitutions between ornamental borders. Perfect copies with the half title are very rare. We have 2 of them, and I believe they both have the half title. But even more cool is this, 1783 or 1738 rather, Anderson's second edition of the Constitutions. This is described as the new book of Constitutions, yada, yada, yada. Says there, no copy appears to be known with the original leaf in situ, but 1 copy at present in private ownership is found attached to the cover. Now, the reason why is because the work was printed with identical typing, 1 paper on 2 different sizes. So the small paper copies could therefore not have taken the plate. This colorful plate here with the pictures on it. could not have taken a plate without it being folded in half. And so, in fact, it seems that none were in fact issued with it, according to William Hewen, who is one of the major Masonic researchers. He stated that he only succeeded up to that time of tracing 26 copies of this edition. Note, one copy is in private ownership, and that would be this copy. How cool is that? Because we actually have a letter of authenticity from William Hewen himself in the front of the book. It says, this is received from my friend and brother, somebody Francis of Philadelphia, USA, sum of £9, 9 shillings for a complete copy of the Book of Constitutions, AD 1738, certified by me to contain every something and page as issued with the original frontispiece, as well as the plate from the list of 1738, very few indeed being something circumstanced. It is rarer than the first edition. W.J. Hewen, Torquay, England, 18th of December, 1896. I know the Grand Lodge does not even have this copy. So I'll leave you with this. Back to Cloudy. Masonry has only gentle methods at her hand for the working out of her great purposes. We wield no battle axe and carry no sword, but the pen is mightier than the sword, and the book is but the printed thought which some man penned. Education is Masonry's greatest tool, and books are at once the foundation and the superstructure of education. So there you go, the Trexler Masonic Library. We may not have a secret handshake, but we do have an amazing collection of books. No password required. Thank you, Chat GPT AI. Our hours were usually open an hour before the stated meetings, which is currently the second Wednesday, second Friday, third Tuesday, third Wednesday, and by appointment. And this is my contact information.